poor waitress paid for a young man's meal. The next day, 300 soldiers lined up for her. Rain tapped steadily against the cafe's windows, with thin streams running down the glass like tears. Inside, the warmth from the coffee machines did little to ease the fatigue pooling in Eliza's shoulders. The late shift always left her drained, but she wore her exhaustion behind a smile, pouring refills and wiping counters with quiet grace. It was nearing midnight when the door creaked open. A gust of cold air swept through, turning a few heads. A young man stepped inside, soaked to the bone, his coat torn at the sleeve and his boots caked with dried mud. He moved slowly, not because of age, but with caution, as if unsure whether he was welcome. Eliza looked up from the till, meeting his eyes. They were clear, startlingly so, beneath his tangled hair and wet eyelashes. He walked to the counter, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," he said, his voice soft, barely louder than the rain. "I just need a meal. I have no money, but if you could spare a sandwich, anything warm, I'll wash. Dishes, clean the floors, whatever you need." Eliza hesitated. He was young, perhaps her age, maybe younger, but the lines on his face told a story far older. There was no begging in his tone, no pity sought, only a quiet dignity wrapped in desperation. She glanced towards the kitchen, then at the serving hatch holding a full plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, a cancelled order, still hot under the lamp. Without another word, she slid the tray off the warmer, added a cup of black coffee, and placed it gently in front of him. "Someone cancelled their order," she said simply. "Seems a waste to throw it out." The man blinked, overcome for a moment. "I thank you," he said. "I truly mean it." She smiled, already, turning back to grab extra napkins. "You don't have to mean it. Just—" But the moment shattered as a sharp voice cut through the quiet. Eliza, her manager, Greg, stepped out from the back, his expression thunderous. "What is this?" "It was a returned meal," she said calmly. "He's hungry." "I don't care if the Pope is hungry," Greg snapped. "We don't give away food." Eliza stood her ground. It would have gone to waste. "That's not your call to make," Greg retorted, his voice rising. "You're not running a charity. You want to feed the whole bloody street. You do it on your own dime." Eliza looked at the young man, who had already set his fork down and was halfway to standing. "I'll leave," he murmured, his face filled with shame. "No," she said quickly, turning back to Greg with renewed resolve. "Take it out of my tips." Greg's lip curled into a sneer. "Don't bother. You're sacked." Silence fell over the cafe like a dropped glass. The few remaining customers froze. Eliza slowly untied her apron, placed it on the counter, and nodded once. There was no anger, no tears, just tired acceptance. She stepped out into the rain, the door swinging shut behind her. The cold hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She walked down the street, her coat thin against the wind, the weight of her decision heavier than her soaked shoes. Behind her, footsteps splashed through puddles. She turned. The young man had followed her, his jacket pulled tight, his eyes searching hers. "I'll never forget what you did in there," he said, his voice rough with cold and something else entirely. "You didn't treat me like rubbish. You saw me." Eliza looked at him, truly looked at him. The storm had etched shadows under his eyes, but something in him was unbroken. She offered a small smile, one hand pressed to her chest to keep in the warmth of that single moment. "Everyone deserves to be seen," she whispered. Then, without another word, she turned and walked into the night, unaware that this choice would echo far beyond what she could ever imagine. The room above the launderette smelled faintly of detergent and mildew. Eliza closed the door behind her with a tired sigh, letting her damp jacket fall onto the lone chair by the wall. The electric heater groaned when she twisted the knob, making more noise than warmth. Smokey, her rescued ginger tabby, meowed from his perch on the windowsill, stretching lazily before curling back into a ball. She sat on the edge of her mattress, her toes tingling with cold, her fingers still clutching the last of her dignity. Sacked, just like that, for giving a stranger a meal someone else had already abandoned. Her tips for the week, what little she had, were already spent on cat food and a half-filled bag of groceries. Rent was due in 4 days, and the Hautenieres electric bill was already overdue. She stared at the ceiling, blinking back tears that refused to fall. The next morning, a knock at the door startled her. Not a loud knock, just 2 soft taps. When she opened it, no one was in the hallway, just a plain white envelope lying on the doormat. Cautiously, she picked it up and stepped back inside. The flap wasn't sealed. Inside was cash, more than enough to cover the next month's rent. She gasped softly, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the note tucked inside. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. People like you deserve more than just survival. There was no name, no signature, just those words and their quiet weight. Eliza clutched the paper to her chest, her mind racing. Who? Why? She thought back to the man from the cafe, his clear eyes, the way he'd looked at her, as if she were the first person to truly see him in a very long time. Later that week, while walking home from a nearby food bank, Eliza paused at the corner by the old church. A small crowd had gathered in the alley beside it. Volunteers were setting up folding tables with flasks of hot food, clean socks, and first aid kits. She stepped closer, drawn by the scent of baked bread and the quiet laughter of people who hadn't had much to laugh about recently. And then she saw him. He had the same eyes, the same build, but was now clean-shaven, wearing a dark wool coat and gloves. He stood behind a table, handing out wrapped sandwiches and thermoses of coffee. His smile was quiet but real, the kind that came from someplace honest. She stood frozen for a moment before stepping forward. "Hey," she said, unsure if he would remember her. He looked up and smiled as though he had been waiting for her. "Eliza," she blinked in surprise. "How did you know my name?" "I asked around," he said simply, reaching beneath the table. He pulled out a wrapped sandwich and offered it to her. She hesitated. "It's turkey," said, "with cranberry sauce." "I remembered. You mentioned it was your favorite when you served me," She accepted it slowly, her fingers brushing against his. It was warm. You didn't have to do this. He shook his head. You gave me my first proper meal in days. This is the first one I get to share. There was a quietness between them, not awkward, just gentle. You look different, she said. He chuckled. A shower and a shave will do that. She studied him. There was something steady in the way he stood, something that didn't quite fit the story of a man down on his luck. But before she could ask more, a woman behind him called his name. Aiden! He turned, gave a small wave, then looked back at Eliza. Come back tomorrow. I'd like to talk more. And with that, he turned back to his table, handing out cups of coffee to a pair of veterans who patted him on the back. Eliza walked home that night with the sandwich still warm in her hands and something even warmer curling in her chest. She didn't know who Aiden really was yet, but she knew somehow that her story with him wasn't over. Autumn deepened into winter in the small town of Millage, casting frost over windows and weaving a chill into the breath of the morning. Yet amidst the cold, Eliza found warmth, not in her struggling electric heater, but in the quiet presence of a man who never quite left her thoughts. Aiden had become a constant in the calm backdrop of her struggling days. At the community soup kitchen, she would often find him already there, before her, tying an apron behind, his back with his sleeves rolled up. He greeted the elderly with a kind nod and the children with warm jokes. At the charity clinic where Eliza had found a part-time job helping to schedule appointments, Aiden would swing by. He would drop off supplies or walk patients across the slushy street without any fanfare. You volunteer everywhere, she teased him once, handing him a box of donated scarves to distribute. I like warm things, he replied with a shrug. People, soup, scarves, smiles. But whenever she asked about him, about his job, where he lived, how he came to be in town, he'd dodge the question with a half smile and change the subject. Some stories take time to tell, he once said, as I flickering towards the snow-dusted rooftops, and some are better heard when you're ready to listen. His mystery should have bothered her, but it didn't not, when his actions spoke louder than most confessions ever could. One morning, as Eliza stepped out of her flat, she found a single daisy placed carefully on the doormat. It was slightly crooked, but bright, against the gray cement. Tied around its stem was a scrap of brown string and a note scribbled on the back of a bakery receipt. Just because the world's been gray doesn't mean you have to be. It was the first time in weeks she had genuinely laughed. Not a tired exhale, not a hollow smile, but an honest laugh that bubbled up and startled even Smokey, who blinked at her from the windowsill. She tucked the daisy into a jam jar and placed it on her nightstand. It stayed there long after its petals began to curl inwards. Their rhythm became something sacred. A nod across the pantry. A cup of hot chocolate passed wordlessly at the bus stop. A shared silence on the church steps after closing time. But one Friday, the chill seeped in, deeper than usual. Eliza woke with a sore throat and a fever that burned behind her eyes. She wrapped herself in layers, but still felt like ice had taken root in her bones. Work called, telling her to rest and stay home. Her neighbor, an elderly woman named Marge, dropped off a flask of ginger tea. But by nightfall, Eliza couldn't keep anything down. She curled into herself beneath 3 blankets with Smokey pressed to her side, shivering despite the space heater humming at her feet. The world felt very far away, her breath short, her head pounding. A soft knock stirred her. Weakly, she shuffled to the door. There was no one there, but on the ground, a small thermos steamed gently inside a cloth-wrapped basket. Beside it was a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she opened the note. I know this town gets cold, especially when your body's fighting to stay warm. Tonight, let me return just a little of what you gave me. It's chicken soup, my mother's recipe. Eat slowly. Feel loved. It was signed with just one letter, A. The soup was rich and golden, with carrots cut unevenly and noodles that clung to the spoon as if they were afraid to be left behind. Each sip warmed more than her stomach. It warmed a place inside her chest that had been quiet for far too long. She didn't see Aiden that night, but she didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, they didn't talk about feelings or plans, but something was building. It was delicate, intentional, a trust not declared but built from shared kindness and unspoken glances. And though she still didn't know who he truly was, Eliza no longer feared the mystery, because whatever his story was, it had led him to her doorstep. And somehow that made all the difference. The knock came like thunder. Eliza opened the door with a hesitant hand, still in the faded uniform from her new cafe job. She had fallen asleep on the sofa, exhausted and heartsick from too many shifts and too little rest. But what she saw on the other side of the door jolted her fully awake. 2 soldiers stood tall in full dress uniform, their caps tucked under one arm, stoic and silent. Behind them stretched a line of black military vehicles, engines, humming, forming an arc around her narrow street. Eliza Hart, taller one asked. She nodded slowly, her breath caught in her throat. You are requested for immediate transport to Fort Alder. I think you have the wrong person, she stammered. We do not. The soldier's voice was firm, but respectful. There is a ceremony. You are the guest of honor. Neighbors were peeking out from behind their blinds, stepping onto their porches, whispering amongst themselves. A child dropped his bicycle on the pavement. A woman clutched her chest. No one understood what was happening, least of all Eliza. The soldiers opened the rear door of the lead vehicle. We have been instructed to escort you with full honors. Eliza didn't know what to say. Her body moved before her brain caught up. She climbed in. As the convoy pulled out of the neighborhood, the sirens were not blaring, but the tension in the air was deafening. A caravan of black SUVs and military trucks rolled through the town like a silent parade. Traffic parted to let them pass. Police had blocked off intersections. People stood on the pavements, pointing, filming on their phones, speculating. Inside the vehicle, Eliza sat, frozen. Her palms were damp. Her heart thundered in her chest. This had to be a mistake. Fort Alder came into view after nearly an hour. High fences, guarded towers, the massive Union Jack snapping against a pale morning sky. The gates opened for them. And there, just past the checkpoint, was a sight that stole Eliza's breath. 300 soldiers stood in perfect formation, shoulder to shoulder, stretching across the parade ground in immaculate rows. The entire front plaza of the base had been cleared for this moment. The soldiers' uniforms were pristine, their boots shined to a mirror finish, medals glinting in the sun. Not a single one moved or spoke. As Eliza stepped out of the vehicle, the silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her shoes crunched on the gravel. She was led trembling down a path lined with an honor guard. Their salutes were raised in unison, sharp, reverent, precise. At the far end of the path, on a small platform flanked by flags, stood a man she barely recognized. But her heart did. It was Aidan, dressed in his formal, military uniform, his chest adorned with medals, cap under his arm, his posture proud, his face no longer shadowed by hunger or fatigue, but lit with clarity and quiet, strength. She stopped halfway. "Aidan?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What is this?" He stepped forward, his tone calm but powerful enough to carry across the square. "My name is Major Aidan Black. I serve in a Special Operations Division under a humanitarian arm of the British Army. For the past few months, I've been undercover, searching, watching." She shook her head, stunned. "You lied to me?" "I didn't lie," he corrected gently. "I just didn't tell you who I was, because I needed to see something the world often forgets." He looked around at the rows of silent soldiers. "I needed to see if kindness still existed without needing credit, if compassion could survive without a spotlight. And then I met you." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Aidan stepped closer. "You gave me food, but more than that, you gave me dignity. You looked at me like I was still someone." She swallowed, hard, her eyes burning. "Why are they all here?" Aidan turned to the soldiers and then back to her. "Because what you did mattered more than you know. We brought 300 soldiers here today, not to intimidate, not to question, but to honor you, to show you what happens when one person doing one right thing shakes the entire system awake." Eliza's hands trembled as she whispered, "I'm just a waitress." Aidan smiled, his eyes soft. "No," he said, "you're the reason hope is still real." And in that moment, before the silence lifted, Eliza realized she hadn't been summoned. She'd been saluted. 5 years later, the autumn sun streamed through the large windows of the Maplewood Veterans and Family Center. The scent of baking bread and simmering soup was a permanent, comforting perfume in the air. The center, once a derelict building, was now the vibrant heart of the town, a testament to a military initiative born from a single act of kindness. Eliza, no longer just a manager, but the soul of the place, moved with a familiar, easy grace. She placed a hand on the shoulder of an elderly veteran reading the paper and shared a laugh with a young mother in the queue for a food parcel. Aidan, now retired from active duty, was never far from her side. He wasn't a major here. He was just Aidan, the man who could fix any leaky tap, tell the best bedtime stories, and listen with a patience that could calm any storm. Their wedding had been a simple affair, held right there in the center's garden, surrounded by the faces of those they had helped and the soldiers who had become their extended family. There were no grand vows, only quiet promises whispered over clasped hands. This afternoon, as the last of the families collected their children, a small girl with bright red wellies ran up to Eliza, clutching a slightly misshapen clay star. "This is for you," she said shyly, "for being the best." Eliza knelt down, her eyes shining. "And this is for you," she said, pulling a freshly baked cookie from her apron pocket. Later, as dusk settled, Aidan wrapped his arms around her as they stood by the kitchen door, watching the first stars appear. A small framed photo sat on the windowsill, a waitress and a soldier on their wedding day, surrounded by a crowd of smiling faces. "You know," Aidan said, softly, his chin resting on her shoulder, "that night in the cafe, I was at my lowest. I thought the world was empty of goodness." Eliza leaned back against him, her heart full. "And now," she whispered. He kissed her temple. "Now I see it everywhere." He turned her to face him, his expression serious, but his eyes dancing with love. "And I see our son taking his first steps in it," he added, a wide grin spreading across his face as he placed a hand gently on her stomach. Tears of pure joy welled in Eliza's eyes. She was no longer the girl who had been fired for a simple act of charity. She was a wife, a pillar of her community, and soon a mother. She hadn't just been given a second chance. She had built a new world, one meal, one smile, one act of love at a time. If this story warmed your heart and reminded you of the quiet strength we all carry, then we invite you to stay with us. Here on Soul-Stirring Stories, we share tales that touch the soul, stories about everyday people who make an extraordinary difference. If Eliza's journey inspired you, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest heroes wear aprons, not armor.